The asylum stood silhouetted against the grey sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out over the desolate landscape. Our team, equipped with an array of paranormal investigation gear, moved cautiously through the crumbling corridors. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something indefinable and unsettling. We documented our initial findings, noting the structural damage, the remnants of old furniture, and the pervasive atmosphere of despair that clung to the walls. In one of the more dilapidated rooms, amidst a pile of fallen plaster and broken bricks, we unearthed something unexpected. An old camcorder, its plastic casing cracked and yellowed with age. Dusting it off, we found a single mini DV tape inside. Back in our makeshift base camp, set up in a relatively stable room, we managed to connect the camcorder to a small monitor. The tape was damaged, the image flickering and distorted, but we were able to make out the last recorded footage. The video showed a lone figure, presumably a previous investigator, whispering frantically into the camera. His face was pale and etched with fear, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He spoke of finding something significant, something he couldn't quite articulate, but his urgency was palpable. He kept glancing towards a doorway at the far end of the room, his anxiety building with each passing moment. Then he turned the camera towards the doorway. A dark figure stood there, its form indistinct in the low light, but its presence undeniable. It was tall and gaunt, its silhouette a stark contrast against the slightly lighter frame of the doorway. The figure remained motionless, as if observing the investigator. The investigator whispered that he didn't have much time, his voice trembling. He turned back to the camera, his eyes wide with terror, before abruptly swinging the lens back towards the doorway. The dark figure was no longer standing still. It was rushing towards the camera, its form a blur of darkness. The recording cut out abruptly, the screen going black. A nervous laughter rippled through our team. We dismissed the footage as likely staged. A bit of amateur dramatics from a previous group, the asylum was known for attracting its share of sensationalists. But as we continued our exploration, our own equipment began to malfunction. Flashlights flickered and died, despite having fresh batteries. Our EMF meter, which had been registering normal levels, suddenly spiked erratically, its digital display flashing wildly. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, a sudden chill that had no apparent source. A feeling of anxiety began to settle over us. The earlier dismissal of the video footage now felt premature, perhaps even foolish. The atmosphere in the asylum seemed to have shifted, becoming heavier, more oppressive. We gathered in the main corridor, comparing notes on the equipment malfunctions. The air felt still, almost expectant. Then from the darkness behind us, a sound reached our ears. It was a slow, ragged inhalation, followed by a deep exhalation, heavy breathing. We froze, our flashlights snapping around to illuminate the darkness behind us. The corridor stretched out, long and empty, the beams of our lights dancing across the peeling wallpaper and broken windows. There was nothing there, but the breathing continued, a slow rasp that seemed to echo through the silence of the asylum. It was definitely behind us, somewhere in the darkness we had just passed through. We turned slowly, our apprehension growing with each labored breath that reached our ears. The darkness remained, and the breathing persisted, a chilling, unseen presence just behind us. The old mansion loomed before us, silhouetted against the twilight sky. Its darkened windows stared out like vacant eyes, and an air of profound neglect clung to its decaying facade. This was Blackwood Manor, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a location synonymous with unexplained disappearances. Our team, a group dedicated to unraveling paranormal mysteries, had come to document any spectral activity. We moved inside, the heavy oak door groaning shut behind us. Dust motes danced in the beams of our flashlights, illuminating peeling wallpaper and decaying furniture draped in white sheets. The silence within the house was absolute, broken only by the creak of floorboards under our feet. Our task was methodical. We strategically placed infrared cameras in key locations throughout the mansion, setting up motion sensors in hallways and rooms where activity had been reported. We ran calibration tests, ensuring all equipment was functioning correctly. As the night deepened, the equipment began to behave erratically. Cameras flickered and died, their batteries inexplicably drained. Motion sensors triggered without any discernible cause, their alarms silent. We checked connections, replaced batteries, but the malfunctions persisted, a frustrating obstacle to our investigation. Frustrated, we decided to review the footage we had managed to capture. We gathered in the main hall, the only room with a semblance of power. As we scrolled through the night's recordings, a chilling discovery unfolded. On one camera, positioned in the long corridor on the second floor, we saw Mark walking down the hallway. Behind him, in the periphery of the frame, a tall, indistinct figure emerged from a darkened room. The figure moved with a fluid, silent grace, its form almost blending with the shadows. It reached out, its hand passing through Mark as if he were not there. Then, Mark simply vanished, the dark figure remaining for a moment before receding back into the darkness. Panic rippled through our small group. Mark was gone, and the footage offered a terrifying explanation. We immediately began searching for him, our flashlights cutting through the gloom of the mansion. We called his name, our voices echoing unanswered through the empty rooms. As we searched, Emily, who had been examining the ground floor, suddenly went silent. We called out to her, but there was no response. We rushed downstairs, our apprehension growing with each silent step. Emily was nowhere to be found. Her flashlight lay on the floor, its beam casting an eerie glow on the dusty floorboards. Another member of our team, Ben, insisted we leave. The atmosphere of the mansion had shifted, becoming actively hostile. We gathered our remaining equipment, our movements hurried and filled with dread. We made our way back to the main hall, towards the front door, but the doorway was empty. The heavy oak door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, seamlessly integrated with the rest of the hallway. We stared in disbelief, running our hands over the smooth, cold surface. There was no sign of hinges, no indication that a door had ever been there. We tried the back door, the windows, every possible exit. Each opening had been replaced by solid walls. The mansion, it seemed, had become a sealed tomb. We were trapped inside, with whatever had taken Mark and Emily. The malfunctioning equipment lay scattered around us, useless. The darkness of the mansion seemed to press in, and the silence was no longer empty but filled with an unseen presence. A faint, scraping sound drifted from the end of the hallway, a sound that seemed to be coming closer. We turned, our flashlights shaking in our hands, illuminating the long, empty corridor. The scraping intensified, and the darkness at the far end seemed to coalesce, to take on a more defined form. The scraping grew louder, and the darkness began to move, and the wrought iron gates creaked open as we pushed them aside, the sound echoing eerily in the stillness of the night. The cemetery lay before us, a silent city of stone under the pale glow of the moon. We had come seeking the spectral, the fleeting glimpses of figures said to roam these grounds after midnight. We moved between the rows of headstones, our footsteps crunching softly on the gravel paths. An immediate sense of the unusual permeated the air. The headstones, weathered and worn with age, bore no inscriptions. They were simply blank slabs of stone, sa'ari of silent sentinels guarding unmarked graves. A peculiar detail caught my eye. At the base of some of the headstones, the soil appeared disturbed, freshly turned. Small mounds of dark earth contrasted sharply with the older, moss-covered ground. I pointed it out to the others, a silent gesture towards the anomaly. We continued deeper into the cemetery, the blank headstones creating an increasingly unsettling atmosphere. The air grew colder, and a sense of isolation settled upon us. Then Mark was gone. One moment he was beside me, examining a particularly large blank headstone. The next there was only empty space. I turned searching, but he had vanished without a sound, without a trace. A new headstone stood where Mark had been. It was identical to the others in shape and size, but etched into its surface, clear and stark in the moonlight, was his name. A wave of disbelief and terror washed over me. This was not the ghostly encounter we had anticipated. This was something else, something far more tangible and horrifying. We backed away from the newly marked grave, our eyes darting nervously around the silent cemetery. The blank headstones seemed to watch us, their empty surfaces reflecting the pale moonlight. Sarah disappeared next. She had been a few steps ahead, her flashlight beam dancing across the blank stones. One moment the light was there, the next it flickered and went out, and Sarah was gone. Another headstone appeared, seemingly rising from the earth itself, and on its surface her name. The remaining members of our group huddled together, our initial bravado completely shattered, replaced by a primal fear. This place was not haunted in the way we had imagined. It was something far more sinister. The ground near Ben's feet seemed to soften, the soil giving way as if something was pulling him down. He reached out, grabbing for our hands, but his grip slipped and he was swallowed by the earth. A new headstone materialized, bearing his name. The speed and finality of it were chilling. There were only 2 of us left now. The silence of the cemetery felt absolute, broken only by our ragged breathing. The blank headstones seemed to press in on us, their silence more menacing than any ghostly wail. I glanced down at the ground near my own feet. The soil looked disturbed, freshly turned. A small mound of dark earth had appeared. My blood ran cold. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the patch of fresh soil, on the empty space where my name would soon appear. The blank headstones seemed to tilt slightly, their silent surfaces reflecting the terror in my eyes. The other remaining member of our group, his face pale with fear, suddenly stumbled. He looked down in confusion, then his eyes widened in horror. The ground beneath him was sinking. He reached out to me, his hand outstretched, but the earth gave way completely and he vanished into the darkness below. A new headstone rose from the ground, his name etched into the weathered stone. I was alone now, surrounded by the silent, blank headstones, the fresh graves of my friends all around me. The mound of fresh soil near my feet seemed to grow larger. I backed away further, my gaze sweeping across the rows of unmarked graves. How many others lay beneath these blank stones, their names etched into existence only after their demise? The ground near me shifted again. The small mound of fresh soil expanded, encroaching on the gravel path. I could feel the earth softening beneath my boots. The blank headstones seemed to lean in, their silent surfaces reflecting the pale moonlight, reflecting my growing terror. The air grew colder and the silence pressed in, suffocating me. I looked down at the ground. The soil was giving way. I could feel myself sinking. The last thing I saw was a blank headstone directly in front of me, and then a faint scratching sound, as if something was etching itself into the weathered stone. The house stood silent, its darkened windows like vacant eyes staring out from a decaying facade. We unloaded the equipment, the latest in motion detection and thermal imaging technology, our anticipation a blend of scientific curiosity and a touch of professional skepticism. This house had a reputation, a long history of unexplained events, the perfect controlled environment to test the boundaries of the known. We meticulously placed sensors throughout the house, covering every room and hallway. Thermal cameras were mounted in strategic locations, their infrared lenses ready to capture any fluctuations in temperature. We calibrated and tested each piece of equipment, ensuring optimal functionality. The house remained quiet, the only sounds our own movements and the soft hum of the electronics. Back in our makeshift control room, set up in the least dilapidated room on the ground floor, the data began to flow. Initially, it was mundane. Temperature fluctuations consistent with the aging structure, the occasional rustling sound picked up by the sensitive microphones. Then, the anomalies appeared. Motion sensors in an upstairs bedroom registered a presence, a distinct figure forming in the data, moving across the room. Yet, the thermal cameras showed no corresponding heat signature. The figure was there, recorded by the motion sensors, but invisible to the infrared. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the digital trace of its impossible existence. Doors, clearly visible on the live camera feeds, began to open and close on their own. No air currents, no structural shifts could account for the precise, almost deliberate manner in which they moved. Our initial skepticism began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of bewilderment. We reviewed the data repeatedly, cross-referencing sensor readings with camera footage, searching for any logical explanation. Could it be faulty equipment, a trick of the light? We ran diagnostics, recalibrated the sensors, but the anomalies persisted. The data was undeniable. Something was happening within the walls of this house that defied the laws of physics as we understood them. The atmosphere within the house shifted. An almost imperceptible drop in temperature, a feeling of being observed, settled upon us. We tried to rationalize it as heightened awareness, the power of suggestion playing tricks on our minds. Then it happened. I was reviewing the thermal feed from the main hallway on my monitor while my partner Sarah was examining the motion sensor data. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed from the hallway. I looked up from my screen, my heart pounding. Sarah was on the floor, several feet from where she had been standing, her body contorted at an awkward angle. She hadn't tripped, she hadn't fallen, she had been violently thrown across the room. I rushed to her side, checking for injuries. She was conscious but dazed, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the empty space where she had been standing. I don't know. One moment I was looking at the sensor readings, the next. Something hit me. It felt like a physical force, but there was nothing there. We replayed the footage from the hallway camera. The recording showed Sarah standing still, reviewing her data, then without any visible interaction, her body lurched violently as if struck by an unseen force, and she was propelled across the room. The motion sensors registered a sudden spike of activity at the exact moment she was thrown, but the thermal cameras showed only Sarah and the ambient temperature of the hallway. The scientific detachment we had maintained until that moment shattered. This was no longer a controlled experiment. This was something real, something powerful, and something that had just physically harmed one of us. We reviewed the sensor data from the moment of the incident, searching for any anomaly, any energy signature that could explain what had happened. The data was baffling. There was no logical explanation, no detectable force that could have caused such a violent displacement. The rest of the night passed in a state of heightened tension. The anomalies continued, the motion sensors triggering in empty rooms, the thermal cameras occasionally catching fleeting, indistinct shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Doors continued to open and close, their movements now imbued with a malevolent intent. We tried to pack up our equipment, our initial curiosity replaced by a desperate desire to leave the house. But as we worked, the activity intensified, equipment malfunctioned at an alarming rate, lights flickered and died. The temperature in the control room plummeted inexplicably. We gathered our remaining functional equipment and made our way to the front door, our hands shaking. But the door wouldn't open. The mechanism was jammed, unyielding to our frantic efforts. We tried the windows, but they were sealed shut, as if welded to the frames. The house seemed to be reacting to our desire to leave, trapping us within its decaying walls. The anomalies continued, growing bolder, more aggressive. We could hear soft scraping sounds from the upper floors, the distinct sound of footsteps in empty rooms. Then the thermal camera in the hallway downstairs began to register a figure. It formed slowly, coalescing out of the ambient temperature, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to absorb the heat from its surroundings. It began to move, its form gliding silently down the hallway towards our control room. The motion sensors registered its approach, a growing presence in the digital data. The scraping sound from upstairs grew louder, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible hum. The thermal figure was now just outside the door of our control room, its dark form filling the frame of the monitor. The motion sensors registered its presence directly on the other side of the door. The door began to rattle, a subtle vibration that grew in intensity. The humming sound intensified, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The thermal figure on the monitor remained still, its dark form a silent, menacing presence. Then the door began to buckle inwards. The dorm room was crowded, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap pizza. Someone produced a Ouija board, a flimsy piece of cardboard that promised contact with the other side. Despite a knot of apprehension in my stomach, I joined the circle, my fingers lightly touching the planchette. The session was unremarkable, filled with the usual ambiguous answers and nervous laughter. I dismissed it as a bit of harmless fun, nothing more than a silly party game. The nightmares began soon after, vivid, disturbing visions that left me shaken and exhausted each morning. I couldn't recall the specifics, only a lingering sense of dread and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Then the bruises appeared. Small purplish marks on my arms, as if someone had gripped me tightly. I couldn't remember bumping into anything, and the bruises seemed to materialize overnight. I tried to rationalize them, attributing them to clumsiness in my sleep, but a seed of disquiet had been planted. A persistent feeling of being followed began to plague me during the day. I would catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting darkness that vanished when I turned my head. The feeling intensified, a constant awareness of an unseen presence just behind me. Sleep became a source of dread. The nightmares continued and the feeling of being watched persisted even in my waking hours. I decided to set up a small digital camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture whatever was causing my unease. I positioned it on my desk, facing my bed, and left it recording overnight. The next morning, I nervously reviewed the footage. The initial hours were uneventful, just the still image of my empty bed in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Then, around 3 a.m., a subtle distortion appeared in the corner of the frame, near the foot of my bed. It was a patch of deeper darkness, an absence of light that seemed to writhe and shift. As I watched, the darkness began to coalesce, taking on a more defined shape. It formed into a tall, indistinct figure standing silently at the foot of my bed, its form obscuring the faint light from the window. The figure remained there for several hours, completely still, before slowly dissipating just before sunrise. A cold dread washed over me as I watched the footage. This was not my imagination. Something was in my room at night, standing over me while I slept. Night after night, I reviewed the camera footage. The shadow figure returned every night, always around the same time, and with each passing day, its form seemed to become a little clearer, a little more defined. The indistinct mass began to take on a more human-like shape, though its features remained shrouded in darkness. Meanwhile, my physical and mental state continued to decline. I felt constantly drained, exhausted even after a full night of sleep. The nightmares intensified, leaving me with a persistent headache and a feeling of profound unease. The bruises on my arms appeared more frequently, and new ones began to appear on my legs and torso. I tried to focus on my studies to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the constant awareness of the shadow figure looming over me at night was a heavy burden. My appetite waned, and I found myself increasingly isolated, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The footage from the camera became my nightly ritual, a morbid fascination with the silent figure that haunted my sleep. Its form continued to sharpen, the edges becoming more distinct. I could now make out the vague outline of a head, shoulders, and limbs, though the details remained elusive. My strength was fading. Simple tasks became an effort. The world around me seemed to grow dim and distant. The nightmares were almost constant now, blurring the line between sleep and wakefulness. One morning I woke to find myself unable to move. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. A profound weakness had taken hold of my body. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a sense of utter helplessness washing over me. I managed to reach for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen as I pulled up the camera footage from the previous night. The shadow figure was clearer than ever before. I could now discern the shape of its face, though its features remained obscured by shadow. It seemed taller, its form more substantial. As I watched the footage, the figure slowly turned its head, as if sensing my gaze. Its faceless void seemed to fixate on the camera lens, on me. A wave of icy terror washed over me. The weakness in my limbs intensified. I could feel a coldness spreading through my body, a chilling sensation that seemed to emanate from within. The room around me seemed to grow darker, the light filtering through the curtains, dimming as if a cloud had passed over the sun. The camera continued to record. The shadow figure on the screen remained still, its faceless gaze fixed on the lens. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room fading into darkness. The coldness within me intensified, a creeping numbness spreading through my limbs. The last thing I saw on the screen was the shadow figure beginning to raise a hand, its form now almost completely defined. And then the darkness in my room deepened, becoming absolute. The camera continued to record the silent, empty room. The shadow figure remained. The hotel room felt cold even before we set up our equipment. It was notorious, room 312, the subject of countless ghost stories and guest complaints. The management, weary of the tales, had granted us access for a night, hoping we could either confirm or debunk the legends of shadow figures. We positioned 3 cameras around the room, ensuring every angle of the bed was covered. One camera focused directly on the space between the 2 double beds where previous guests claimed to have experienced the most intense activity. We also set up audio recorders, hoping to capture any disembodied voices or unexplained sounds. We settled into the room as night fell, the silence amplifying the subtle creaks and groans of the old building. Sleep eventually claimed us, a fitful rest punctuated by the occasional unsettling feeling of being watched. The next morning we gathered around the laptop, eager to review the night's recordings. The initial footage was uneventful, showing us settling into our respective beds and eventually falling asleep. We fast-forwarded through the hours of our slumber, waiting for anything out of the ordinary. Then it appeared. Around 2:17 a.m., a tall, slender figure materialized in the space between our beds. It was dark, almost a void in the dim light of the room, and it lacked any discernible features. No face, no discernible clothing, just a tall, amorphous shape standing completely still. We watched, transfixed, as the figure remained there for several minutes. It did not move, did not interact with the environment, simply stood as a silent sentinel between us. The footage was clear, the figure unmistakable. We checked the timestamps on all 3 cameras. The figure appeared simultaneously on each recording, confirming it wasn't a lens flare or some other visual anomaly. Next, we reviewed the audio recordings. We listened intently to the hours of silence, the only sounds our own soft breathing as we slept. There were no unexplained noises, no disembodied whispers, nothing but the ambient silence of the room. Then, just as the figure began to fade from view on the footage, a single word, whispered and chilling, cut through the silence of the audio recording. It was faint, almost swallowed by static, but undeniably there. The word was leave. Immediately after the whisper, the footage on all 3 cameras abruptly cut out, the screens going black. Our equipment had inexplicably stopped recording. We looked at each other, a shared sense of dread and bewilderment in our eyes. What had we just witnessed? Who or what was the tall, faceless figure? And who had whispered that single ominous word? We spent the rest of the morning meticulously examining the room. We checked for any drafts, any possible explanations for the figure's appearance. The room was sealed, the windows locked. There were no hidden compartments, no logical explanation for what we had seen, and the air in the room felt different now, colder, heavier. The silence seemed more profound, imbued with a sense of horror. The image of the tall, faceless figure standing between us as we slept was burned into our minds. We packed our equipment, our initial excitement replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. The whispered warning echoed in our thoughts. As we stood in the doorway, ready to leave room 312, a subtle scratching sound drifted from within the room, a sound that seemed to come from the very space where the figure had stood. We glanced back into the darkness of the room, a profound sense of terror settling over us. The scratching continued, a faint, insistent sound that seemed to beckon us back into the silence and the shadows. We did not enter. We left the door ajar, the scratching sound still audible from within, and walked away. The trail wound deeper into the wilderness, the trees growing taller and denser, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The air was still and quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves under our boots. We had been hiking for hours, seeking a sense of solitude far from civilization. We stumbled upon it unexpectedly, a small, dilapidated cabin nestled in a secluded clearing. It looked abandoned, the wood weathered and grey, the windows dark and empty. Curiosity drew us closer. The door creaked open with a groan as we pushed it inward, revealing a single, dusty room. A musty odour hung in the air, the scent of decay and forgotten time. A few pieces of broken furniture lay scattered around, covered in a thick layer of dust. In a corner, on a rickety wooden shelf, we spotted it, an old video camera, coated in dust, with a single VHS tape lying beside it. We examined the camera, its outdated design a relic of a bygone era. The tape was unlabeled, its surface scratched and worn. A sense of intrigue, mixed with a touch of apprehension, settled over us. Incredibly, the cabin still contained a working television, a bulky CRT model sitting on a small table. An equally dusty VCR sat beneath it, connected with frayed wires. We carefully inserted the tape into the VCR, our anticipation building. The screen flickered to life, displaying static for a moment before resolving into a grainy image. A man sat in what appeared to be another room within the cabin, his face pale and etched with terror. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes wide with fear. He began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with a desperate urgency. He spoke of something outside, something he couldn't see but could feel, something that was getting closer. His words were fragmented, filled with panic, but the message was clear. He was terrified and begging for help. As the video progressed, the man's fear intensified. He would occasionally glance towards a darkened corner of the room, his eyes darting nervously. He spoke of strange noises, of a presence that was constantly around him, a presence that felt malevolent. The lighting in the video flickered erratically, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. Each time the light returned, the man looked more disheveled, his eyes wider, his voice more strained. In the final moments of the recording, the man stared directly into the camera, his eyes filled with a raw, primal fear. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then his gaze shifted to something just beyond the frame, his eyes widening in absolute horror. A sudden jerk, and the camera was violently knocked to the side. The last frame showed the man's wide, terrified eyes staring into the lens before the image was abruptly cut short, replaced by the buzzing static of a dead signal. The television screen remained filled with static, the silence in the cabin broken only by the faint whirring of the VCR. We sat there, frozen. The horrifying images from the video burned into our minds. The man's terror felt real, his desperate plea echoing in the stillness of the abandoned cabin. Then, from the darkness behind us, just outside the cabin, came a scream. It was a raw, piercing sound, filled with unimaginable agony and terror, a sound that cut through the quiet of the wilderness and sent a jolt of pure fear through us. We turned abruptly towards the doorway, our hearts pounding in our chests, the static on the television screen a silent backdrop to the chilling sound that had just erupted from the darkness. The scream echoed through the trees, fading into an unsettling silence, leaving us in the dim light of the cabin, facing the open doorway, the darkness beyond concealing whatever had produced that horrifying sound. The old house had a certain charm, a sense of history etched into its weathered brick and overgrown garden. We were excited to start our new life together within its walls, overlooking the quirks and imperfections that came with its age. During our initial exploration, we discovered a heavy metal door in the basement, tucked away in a dark corner behind the furnace. It was locked, a sturdy deadbolt securing it firmly. The door was solid, with no hinges visible on our side, adding to its mysterious nature. Days turned into weeks as we settled in, the locked door a constant source of curiosity. We tried various methods to open it, old keys we found in a drawer, even attempting to pick the lock, but nothing worked. Finally, we resorted to more forceful measures, spending an afternoon prying at the frame with a crowbar until the metal groaned and the door reluctantly swung inward. The room beyond was small and windowless, the air inside stale and cold. The walls were bare concrete, covered in a network of deep, jagged scratches that ran vertically from floor to ceiling. The scratches looked old, some filled with dust, others appearing more recent. The room felt claustrophobic, the silence within it absolute and unsettling. We found nothing else inside, just the bare walls and the lingering sense of something deeply wrong. We left the door open, a constant reminder of the strange discovery. A few weeks later, feeling a sense of worry about the house, we installed a home security system, placing cameras at the entrances and key areas, including one focused on the basement door. We wanted the peace of mind that came with knowing our home was secure. One morning, after a particularly restless night, I decided to review the overnight footage from the basement camera. The initial hours showed nothing unusual, just the empty hallway and the open metal door. Then, around 3 a.m., a dark shape appeared in the frame, standing just inside the basement door. It was tall and indistinct, a silhouette against the faint light filtering down the stairs. It remained completely still, its form unmoving, as if patiently waiting. The camera recorded for several minutes. The dark shape, a silent presence in the doorway, then as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. A wave of icy dread washed over me as I watched the footage. I showed it to my partner, and we decided to go down to the basement to investigate. We approached the metal door cautiously, the unsettling image from the security footage fresh in our minds. The door was closed, and it was locked. The deadbolt was firmly in place, the same way we had found it weeks ago. We tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. We stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. We hadn't locked the door. We had left it open after our initial exploration of the strange room. I tried to force the door open again, using the crowbar, but this time it wouldn't yield. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut with immense force. The metal groaned under the pressure, but the lock remained firmly engaged. We stood there in the dim light of the basement hallway, staring at the locked metal door. The silence was broken only by our ragged breathing. The image of the dark shape in the doorway replayed in my mind, its stillness now imbued with a terrifying significance. We tried calling out, but our voices echoed unanswered in the empty basement. We pressed our ears against the cold metal of the door, listening for any sound from within the small windowless room. There was nothing, only silence. The scratches on the walls of that room flashed in my memory, their jagged lines now seeming more menacing than before. What had made those marks? And what was now locked inside behind that heavy metal door? We continued to try and open the door, our efforts growing more frantic with each passing moment, but it remained sealed, a solid barrier between us and whatever lay beyond. Finally exhausted and filled with a growing sense of terror, we retreated upstairs, leaving the locked metal door in the basement undisturbed. The security camera continued to record the empty hallway, the dark rectangle of the locked door, a constant reminder of the unseen presence within. That night, sleep eluded us. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of fear through us. We kept glancing at the security feed from the basement, watching the silent hallway and the locked metal door. Around the same time as the previous night, the dark shape reappeared on the screen, standing once again in the doorway. It remained there, motionless, for several minutes before vanishing. The next morning, the basement door was still locked. We have not opened it since. The camera continues to record, and every night, around the same time, the dark shape returns to stand silently at the door, as if still. The cemetery lay under a pristine blanket of snow, the white expanse muffling the sounds of the nearby town. I walked slowly towards his grave, the crunch of my boots the only sound in the stillness. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine from the surrounding trees. His headstone stood stark against the white, a familiar comfort in the landscape of my grief. As I approached, I noticed something peculiar in the undisturbed snow around the grave. Footprints, one set, clearly defined, leading directly to the base of the headstone. But there were no footprints leading away. I paused, my brow furrowed in confusion. Had someone simply walked up to the grave and then vanished? It made no sense. The snow was deep and unbroken in every other direction. I circled the headstone, examining the area closely. The single set of prints ended abruptly at the stone, as if the person had simply ceased to exist. A shiver ran down my spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cold. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs of the strange footprints, capturing the way they led to the grave, and stopped. Later that day, still puzzled by the anomaly, I posted one of the photos online, hoping someone might offer a logical explanation. The responses were varied, ranging from the mundane to the outlandish, but none provided a satisfactory answer. The mystery of the footprints remained. That night, a sense of anxiety settled over me. The image of the footprints leading to but not away from his grave kept replaying in my mind. I checked the live feed from my doorbell camera, a habit I had developed for security. The camera showed the quiet street, the snow-covered driveway, and the front of my house. Then, at the very edge of the frame, near the end of the driveway, I noticed a figure. It was standing still, facing my house, its form silhouetted against the darkness. I zoomed in on the image, but the figure remained indistinct. A dark shape at the periphery of my property. It did not move, simply stood there as if observing the house. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. I checked the time stamp on the footage. It had been standing there for several minutes. I continued to watch the live feed, my eyes fixed on the figure at the edge of the driveway. It remained motionless, a silent watcher in the night. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camera's view. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but the feeling of unease persisted. Unable to shake the unsettling feeling, I decided to check outside before going to bed. I put on my coat and boots and stepped out into the cold night air. The snow crunched under my feet as I walked down the driveway towards the spot where I had seen the figure on the camera. The snow was undisturbed, save for my own footprints. I reached the end of the driveway, scanning the street. There was no sign of anyone. As I turned back towards the house, I noticed them. Fresh footprints in the snow, distinct and clear, leading from the edge of my driveway directly up to my front door. They were different from my own, larger and deeper. I followed the prints with my gaze as they approached my porch, stopping just before the front steps. I had not made these prints. No one should have been on my property. A wave of icy terror washed over me. The footprints at his grave, leading to but not away. The figure at the edge of my driveway, standing and watching, and now these new footprints leading directly to my front door. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the footprints in the snow on my front door. The house stood silent, its windows dark. The only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees. I reached the end of my driveway, my gaze still fixed on the footprints leading to my door. The snow-covered street stretched out before me, empty and silent. The figure was gone. The footprints at his grave remained unexplained. And now, these new footprints leading directly to my home. I stood there in the cold night air, the silence broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart, the unanswered questions hanging heavy in the stillness. My life revolved around the static. The hiss and crackle of white noise held a strange fascination for me. A potential conduit to the other side, I spent countless nights recording, meticulously reviewing hours of audio, searching for those fleeting whispers from beyond the veil. Electronic voice phenomena. The perfect EVP, a clear, undeniable voice from the departed, was my obsession. Then, one night, it happened. During a recording session in an old, supposedly haunted asylum, I captured something different. Amidst the usual static, a faint whisper almost swallowed by the noise, but undeniably there. It sounded like a woman's voice and it spoke my name. I replayed it countless times, each repetition sending a shiver down my spine. It was faint, ethereal, but it was my name. I had finally done it. I had captured the perfect EVP, but the experience didn't end with the playback. Even when my recording equipment was off, in the quiet of my own home, I began to perceive the voice. A faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing, always my name. I initially dismissed it as my mind playing tricks, the result of my intense focus on the recording. However, the whispers persisted, growing slightly more distinct. Soon other things began to happen in my house. Doors would creak open on their own. I would feel a cold touch on my arm when no one was there. Objects would shift position overnight. The activity escalated, and so did the voice. It was no longer just a whisper of my name. It began to speak in fragmented phrases, snippets of sentences that seemed to drift in and out of my awareness. They were always directed at me, personal, knowing. The voice guided me, subtly at first. A suggestion to look in a certain drawer, an inclination to go into the attic. I found myself following these impulses, driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of dread. The sentences became clearer, more coherent. The voice seemed to know my thoughts, my fears. It spoke of things I had long forgotten, secrets I had buried deep within myself. One night the voice became insistent, directing me towards the basement, a part of my house I rarely used. It spoke of something hidden, something I needed to see. A profound sense of panic settled over me, but the compulsion was too strong to resist. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and dust. The voice echoed around me, guiding me through the darkness. Towards a far corner of the room, it directed me to an old wooden trunk tucked away beneath a pile of forgotten belongings. The voice became a constant murmur in my ear, urging me to open it. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside the trunk, I found a collection of old photographs. They were faded and yellowed with age, but the faces in them were chillingly familiar. They were pictures of my family, my parents, my grandparents, and a woman I didn't recognize. The voice whispered her name, a name that resonated with a terrible familiarity. It spoke of a past I had no memory of, a history shrouded in darkness. The photographs depicted scenes of joy, of normalcy, but there was an undercurrent of something sinister, something hidden just beneath the surface. As I delved deeper into the trunk, I found more photographs, letters and documents, each piece of evidence painting a horrifying picture. The woman in the photographs was my mother's sister, someone I had never known existed. The letters spoke of a terrible accident, a disappearance, a family secret that had been carefully guarded for generations. The voice continued to speak, filling in the gaps, revealing the truth behind the photographs and letters. The accident hadn't been an accident. The disappearance had been deliberate. The family secret was a web of lies and deceit. The voice led me to a final item in the trunk, a small leather-bound diary. Its pages were filled with my aunt's handwriting, her words chronicling a descent into madness, a story of betrayal and despair. The final entry was chilling, hinting at a terrible act, a final, desperate attempt to reveal the truth. The voice fell silent. The basement was still and cold. I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of a hidden past, the horrifying truth laid bare before me. Then, a new sound, a soft scraping from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing in the shadows, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its form indistinct in the dim light. It raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. And then the voice returned, no longer a whisper in my ear, but a clear, resonant tone emanating from the figure in the shadows. It spoke a single sentence, a chilling revelation that connected everything. The whisper of my name, the escalating activity, the hidden history in the trunk. The figure began to move towards me, its form solidifying in the darkness. The voice continued to speak, its tone growing stronger, more insistent. The scraping sound intensified, and the darkness in the basement seemed to deepen, to coalesce around the figure. The voice spoke again, its words echoing in the confined space, revealing a truth more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The figure was now just a few feet away, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. The scraping sound was directly behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glimpse the source of the sound. Standing in the doorway, its form silhouetted against the faint light from upstairs, was another figure. Tall and gaunt, identical to the one approaching me. The voice spoke one last time, its words a chilling pronouncement that sealed my fate. The figures closed in.